The 5 aims of the governance module: leadership by the board, membership of the board, roles and responsibilities of the board, effective function of the board, and accountability of the board. Aim 1, the leadership, that there should be a board or a leadership group, call it what you like, who is holding the organization and its work to account. And the director or CEO or whatever you call them has to answer to them. Aim number 2, the membership, is that whoever's on your board, you would expect to agree to the same vision, values, and goals before they actually come into the organization. Aim number 3, the board helps to ensure that the organization is legally registered. And in the case of churches, do you have consent to work with children? Aim number 4, the board or the church leadership meets regularly and a record is kept of the decisions that are made. And aim number 5 is about accountability. Members of the board behave with integrity and are trustworthy and are concerned about the interests of the organization. So they're the 5 aims. And I would like us to now have an open discussion around 8 questions. Number 1, what might be the ideal number of a board and why? So who has an opinion? I can see Julie has said 5 members.
Thank you, Mim. Good afternoon, everyone. I think 5 is the ideal number because it also helps in decision making. You know, when you're many people, you fail to come to an agreement. But when you're 5 and you know what you're doing, it is easy to make decisions for the good of the organization. That is why I believe 5 is okay.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Imi, you've made a point that it shouldn't be an even number. Maybe in a minute, you or somebody else would explain why. Anybody else want to comment on why the director should report to the board? Question 3, should a director be a voting member of the board?
Well, as adding to Imi's contribution, the director is usually the accounting officer, accounting in terms of funds and other responsibilities within the organization. Therefore, he should be the one to report to the board. And secondly, in most cases, the director is the technical advisor to the board, because the board may consist of various people who don't actually know the technicalities of the organization.
Thank you very much.
That's my submission.
Thank you. I know you're saying the board needs oversight. Jackie, you say you have a question. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I was wondering, for a church, is there any other way of them accounting away from having board members?
I think Patrick is online. I'm sure he can contribute something in a moment. Churches tend not to have boards. The ones that I know of would often have some sort of elders or leadership group. And then they would often have deacons or lay readers. And so there's those 2 levels. Now, traditionally, the elders or leaders are looking at the strategy and the direction and the preaching and the ministry, and the deacons are looking at the practical working out of that. In some denominations, they have to account to a higher body. So in the Anglicans, for example, they report into the, I don't know what you call it, however their structure works. In the non-conformist churches, particularly Baptist churches, they don't really report outside of themselves. Each church is independent. Patrick, would you have something to add to that?
Thank you so much, Mim. I think you kind of got us off on the right start. So different churches have different structures that that they follow, and so for churches like the Baptist, they're referred to as congregational. So that's why they kind of have like an AGM every year, but the congregation is represented by the board on a regular basis. So that happens. Now, there are other churches, denominations, where you report to an outside body, and that Anglicans and the Catholics as well. So there's like an outside body to accountable to. And also that outside body can influence what happens within.
Okay, let's move on. How often do you think a board should meet? Should they meet monthly or quarterly or annually? I think that my answer would begin with it depends. So anybody want to have a go at why it would depend?
I go ahead.
Please do.
Yes, in my opinion, I think there should be regular meetings. For example, depending on the kind of work that the organization does. For example, for a school setting, I would think that meeting at least on a quarterly basis be good. However, depending on the kind of services, I think each board can decide when, how often, and the periods to take on. Yeah.
I have heard of one or two global boards that only meet once or twice a year, but they are such a high level where they would be only looking at very strategic changes. So I think it depends on the type of board that it is. Normally they would meet once a quarter, or if there's particular issues, they might have to meet more often. And to avoid having to pull everybody in at the same time, you might have subcommittees. So you might have a finance subcommittee or something. Number 5, why do you think it's important that board members have the same values as the organisation? If you think about the power of a board, what sort of power do they have? Yes, Becca.
I was just going to say, I think it's very important because they are responsible for making decisions or passing decisions, that they should be in line with the aims and vision of the organisation or church.
Thank you, Becca. Which Imi confirms in the chat, they have to support the organisation. Sometimes, obviously, a board will help to make a decision to adjust the vision and the mission. But if an organisation, for example, was set up for the purposes of serving, I don't know, something very specific like children's heart conditions, and some people came into the board and said, no, we want it to be supporting mothers' income generating projects for goat breeding. It moves it so far from its origins that one wonders. You'd almost be better to close an organisation down and start something up. I actually worked for one organisation that decided it had served its purpose, and it just phased out very nicely with a good celebration at the end. And we'll come to that in the governance module, that sometimes we serve our purpose and it's time to close. And so you've got to have really wise board members to make sure that you are making the right decisions. St. Paul's Chobando is very important, since the decisions they make must be focused on the vision of the organisation. Number 6 asks, what's the board's role in legal compliance? Does anybody know the answer to that? There is actually some official role of the board in the legal standings? Okay, let me give you a clue. Obviously, an organization has to have some sort of constitution or structure, and they will have some sort of agreed highest tier of leadership, whether that's the board or the trustees or whatever. And legally, they are the owners of that organization. What that means is if the organization goes bust, then it's possible that they will come looking for those trustees. So normally with a charity, it's written into the legal documents, the legal, what do you call it? The original documentation when you're setting up the organization, that they are only liable for the smallest unit of currency. So it might be 5,000 shillings, for example, or £1. So that when it's a charity, you shouldn't be going bust anyway, because you shouldn't have lots of loans that would make you go bust. But somebody has to be responsible for the closure. Now, if you're running some business wing, then you might well, or you're on the board of some business, you might well actually be a shareholder, and therefore you are responsible for helping to pay the debts when it all collapses. So when you are joining a board, if somebody asks you to join a board, do make sure you know what your liabilities are before you sign up to it. You don't want to commit your house and your car unless you're absolutely convinced that if it all goes wrong, you're willing to lose it as well. It's not the board that will go running around after all the paperwork. They would have staff who they would be making sure are doing that, but the board should be holding those staff to account that those processes have been done. Number 7, and we've only got a couple of minutes. What sorts of roles should there be within the board? From the conversation we've already had, I think you might have some guesses. What sorts of people would you want on the board, or what positions, what subcommittees possibly? Does anybody have any ideas? What roles would you want to be on the board? Finance and legal. If you're working with children, what might you want represented within your board? Yes, it does depend on the type of organization. Child protection, yes. If you're a school, you would probably want somebody that has an education background. If you're working with children, you want somebody who's really hot on child protection issues. Then within the board, you need to appoint your chair, your vice chair, your treasurer, and your secretary. So you need somebody who's also got a leaning towards admin to make sure that things are done correctly. The director or administrator would be a non-voting, well, they're not even a member of the board. They would be required to attend the board meetings, but you would not normally have the director with any power within the board, because obviously then they can influence things in their favor. Finally, because our time is up, how would you recruit good board members? Any ideas? You want board members? Our networks need good board members, and we wonder where to find them. Any ideas where you would go and find a good board member? We could find them from an AGM, yes, where people would nominate and then vote. There would have to be a process to check on who that person is. Are they going to be a good person? Do they have any criminal background? Do they have any interests that would favor the organizations, or are they coming on behalf of their own interests? Jackie, correct? People with the same values committed to the organization. And Becca's saying people with experience in similar fields, so possibly from other NGOs. You can sometimes recommend people who you know, but let them go through a process. There should be actually a recruitment process, just the same that there would be for an interview. You might headhunt rather than vote, but you do need to go through quite a careful process to make sure that you're getting the right people. We'll also look at the whole issue of being able to remove board members, which normally would start with somebody not turning up for 3 meetings. You can't have somebody on a board who doesn't come. That's not helpful. All right, thank you all for your participation. And we will see you next week.
Thank you, Becca, for standing in. My home power has just gone, so I just need to hotspot and get back hosting. But carry on.
Fine. Enoch has his hand raised, so Enoch.
Hi. Yeah, I was just going to agree with what was said previously about having an odd number of people on the board. 5 is a good number because you don't end up in a situation where there's a stalemate. If there's a vote, you'll be able to figure out more easily who the majority is or any particular decision. So yeah, that makes sense to have that number.
That's great. Thanks, Enoch. Mim, are you ready to take back over now?
Let me ask question 2 while I'm still connecting. Question 2 was, why should a director report to the board? Any idea? Why should a director report to the board? Imi, you're saying accountability? Can you amplify on that? Or anybody else? Imi, you say accountability?
Yes, I have said the director has to report to the board for purposes of accountability, because where the board is not, it is the director who is taking full charge of what is happening within the organization. For example, in terms of the projects running, the finances, and these are some of the things that help how the organization is performing is what helps the board to make some of the decisions that they need to be making to see that the organization moves forward. I thinking.
Thank you, Imi.
Anybody else want to comment on why the director should report to the board?